Please take our seats and so we can get going. Thank you. Okay. So clearly at this rate, the problem is the setting outside is too beautiful, the weather is too fantastic, and the food is too good. So tomorrow we'll fast, we'll bring on a Cape Southeaster, and hopefully we'll be a bit more punctual. So good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for being back. And we've got two fantastic sessions post-lunch, and it's a great privilege for me to introduce you to Professor Phil Harrison, or Phil, who is a long-standing collaborator and supporter of ACC in various capacities, and is one of the leading planning and urban theorists and thinkers and practitioners in South Africa, but certainly has been doing incredible work to think across geographies such as China, the rest of Africa, Southern Africa, and Phil will guide this afternoon's session and summon his former status as a National Planning Commissioner in South Africa to make sure everyone addresses the national question, as we would say. So thank you, everyone, for being back. And Phil, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks so much, Edgar. So there's no dramatic entry to this session. We don't have a Michael here. Nothing. But hopefully the excitement will come from the insights of the panelists, and there will be something mind-bending. So welcome to session 3. Session 3 has a 3-part heading, and it's important to note the heading. The stakes, bringing Agenda 2063 to life, and there's an assumption there that maybe someone might comment on. And then a vision for green industrialization and Pan-African connectivity. So I really appreciate the care and the creativity taken in putting these 3 days together, and I really appreciated Edgar's arc of the conference, which gave us the logic and how we ranged from the broad macro issues in the morning now to the mechanics and the pathways of implementation. There's also the logic of scales. So the first session really was the macro context, drawing from what's been happening in Egypt, for example. The second session, a wonderful session, was focusing on the subnational, and we got insights into really concrete examples of what was happening, a nice sort of Kenyan theme in that session, looking at Nairobi, Kisumu, Mombasa, and so on. But this is the hybrid session, also the after-lunch session, but we'll keep you entertained. It's the hybrid session which connects across the Pan-African to the national, to the community. It moves across scales. And so the real key question, as Edgar helped frame it, was what are the stakes as we seek to combine this large-scale policy making and policy direction. We have a particular theme here around Agenda 2063 with community level. To do what? To trigger a fundamental shift in the economy. And the proposition of this session is that green industrialization is one of the key pathways to achieving a sustainable economy, and that we can do it through Pan-African connectivity. So I'm hoping that the panelists would speak to some of that. And I really was taken with Edgar's call to rethink the notion of value. And so what green industrialization really does is it connects the motivating power of profit, of what we might yesterday have called the extractive logic, with the collective social logic, with a collective social logic of existential importance. And it's this combination which I think makes it, but it's the panelists who can comment, a possible, if not a probable pathway to sustainability, if we can get to use the lingo, get the conditions right, the regulations, the financing, the risk profile, and so on. But the other key proposition of this session is that an economic framework or an economic shift must be enabling for sustainable placemaking, and sustainable placemaking should also feed back into the economic shift. So it's that link. I'm interested to hear how the panelists will make that link, but it's that link which we're talking about in this session. So I don't have to say much more because we have a scene setter before I wade into territory that's too deep for me. We have a scene setter, and it's the ACC's very own Anton Cartwright. So thank you, Anton, who is also, if you don't know, a member of the IPCC working group on finance. So he really has the insight, and we're going to give him a few extra minutes. I don't know if it's fair or not, but we're going to give him 12 minutes to spell out the economic case for an infrastructure-led approach to green infrastructure. So let me start with Anton. I'll introduce the other panelists as they speak. Anton, it's yours.
All right.
12 minutes.
Thank you, Phil, and yeah, lovely to see everyone. So if this session is about the economic stakes, or how infrastructure, placemaking, and industrialization come together in a climate-changing world, then really I only have one point to make. And that is that the three distinct conversations, so that'll be industrialization, and I know that some of my climate-sensitive friends in the audience don't like to talk about industrialization in Africa and that it mostly hasn't happened, but it is actually still the flagship policy, economic policy in many African countries. So the conversation around industrialization, the conversation around urbanization, which is more familiar to many of us, and the focus of UN Habitat, national urban policies, and multi-level governance, and the conversation around climate change, that'll be nationally determined contributions, energy policies, the work of C4T and ICLE and others who are in this room. That these three strands of policy work that I suspect many of you have been involved in and contributed to really need to be woven into one narrative and one effort focused on people-centered, nature-centered, deeply sustainable human development. And this is necessary not just for the respective success of those three strands, because they cannot succeed on their own, but actually, as was touched on in the earlier sessions, to allow the continent to contribute the low-carbon, nature-protecting or enhancing inclusive development that both African countries need, but probably more importantly, that the world needs the African continent to make. And it should not be possible to talk about any one of these three things, industrialization, urbanization, and climate change, in isolation, as has been the case very often to date. Okay? So we've got to create the spaces, the arenas, if you like, for a singular interwoven conversation. And that's a priority. And that's really my only point, but I was given 12 minutes, so let me back up a little bit.
Take it.
It's very unlikely, unlike me, to be finished ahead of schedule. I guess for me, the most intriguing conversation at COP27 really, at its essence, centered around like who is a developing country, what is a developing country, and when do you stop being a developing country? And actually, if this term is at all useful in any way, right? And I say that as someone who was sort of trained as a development economist, so I'm quite vested in this in this question. Of course, the context at COP, which has already been mentioned, was the conversation around loss and damage, who has emitted what historically, and accordingly, who should be compensating who for the damage that's already ensued. And we have some pretty good data on this, right? Historical picture on the left, what the UN calls the Annex II countries, the 23 affluent countries have emitted historically, if we go back to the 1850-1900 baseline, have emitted over half the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere today, right? And they really do have a case to answer. This is the loss and damage conversation, especially when you look at per capita emissions. And yeah, I guess it is, we can agree. It's unacceptable that the EU only cut emissions by 0.8% this year, and actually the US, with all their resources and institutional capacity, actually increased their emissions 1.5% in 2022. That is not good enough. But it's important, and this is really what the Sharm el-Sheikh conversation surfaced, is what's happened since 2020. And that's where the story becomes a little bit more complicated, because since 2020, the four biggest emitting countries have been China, the US again, India, and then Russia. Okay? In fact, China twice as much as anyone else. So what for loss and damage, right? Where does that place us? And it's important. And by the way, South Africa sits, I think, at number 13 in the world since 2020, which is really quite an uncomfortable position for us to be in, given the state of our energy system and the state of our economy as well. Right? We shouldn't be at 13. And it's important because I guess the Earth systems, the 4 billion-year-old Earth systems, which we have disrupted with the Anthropocene, and sit behind this climate change phenomenon, they really don't care whether you're in Annex 1, Annex 2, or anything else country, and they don't actually care about per capita emissions either. It's an absolute problem. So let me be very clear. And we definitely need climate justice and more flows of climate grants, and even some concessionary finance under the loss and damage umbrella. But strategically, it seems to me, and this is my proposition, Phil, that African countries confront a choice, really. Yeah. They can, on the one hand, stand on their developing country status, hope for some loss and damage money, which almost certainly, despite the new fund, won't be enough and won't arrive on time and will probably be expensive or substituting something else, as we've heard this morning. They can squabble about who gets to emit the last 380 billion tons, or as my IPCC colleague Weru just suggested in a post last week, that actually might be 260 billion tons. And how's that going to go for African countries, given that squabble is probably going to be against China, India, and we can do that, right? Which is sort of where a lot of the conversation energy is being spent at the moment. Or, as an alternative, we could try and stitch together strategies around our cities, our urbanization, around our industry and climate-resilient development to use the low-carbon status that we currently have, right? That carbon credit that Carlos referred to try and steal a march, or at least carve out some space for ourselves in the global economy. Okay. And we have some evidence as to what this might look like as a strategy from work we did in Ghana and in Tanzania, where we compared industrialization pathways using the conventional model of SEZs and extractive industries that exist in both those countries. And we compared it to an alternative industrial pathway, really catered around, on the continent anyway, the sort of 23 million people that we add to urban spaces every year, and will continue to add to urban spaces every year for the next 3 decades in the African continent. An industrialization strategy that catered to the needs which we pretty much know that they are going to have around building material, energy, food, mobility, water, sanitation, ecosystem goods and services, and I suppose, to use the jargon, the sort of endogenous green industrial pathway, right? And the results were pretty stark in terms of number of people that you work for, and in fact the economic and socio-economic returns that you get from an alternative green industrial pathway. And it kind of builds on something which, I don't know if Carlos is still here, but he reminded me of in Ghana. We said, the goal for Ghana shouldn't be to produce the next Toblerone. It should just be to export the cocoa butter being used to make Toblerone. Right? Build off what you have, the value chains you have, and take that forward. So, perhaps most importantly, if we are going to take this seriously and weave together a single conversation around industrialization, urbanization, and climate resilience development, we need to make the point that globally, it's not going to be possible to decarbonize poverty and inequality, but that we have to harness the global decarbonization effort to address the poverty and inequality that we live with, particularly on the African continent, right? And I think we can do this in ways that restore the long severed links between people, places, nature, well-being, this recasting, if you like, of the relationship between people and the natural environment, or people as part of the natural environment, that I think, or I like to think, and I hope this is not fanciful, that African countries understand actually better than almost anywhere else in the world. Right? And in that, we have the great advantage of being able to draw on, this graph, which you've probably seen, which is really the precipitous fall in renewable energy prices. This has been referenced this morning already. Solar PV on the left, wind energy on the right, to really the bottom end of the levelized cost of fossil fuel energy. So, the global energy transition and the cost of renewable energy is really on our side in the story. It's just one of the pieces of the puzzle. But in this game, the challenge for African countries is not to try and leverage their victimhood of being developing, emerging, third world, annex, non-annex one, whatever you want to call it, but to the point made earlier, that psychological space, by the way, is always going to be associated with higher costs of capital, to the point that was made earlier. That's what tees up the higher cost of capital. To move away from that and to stand on the heritage that we have, the knowledge that we have, and to build on the existing efforts of our people to carve out a place in a globally constrained, in a carbon-constrained global economy. And in case you think this is completely pie in the sky, then I'll leave you with this last slide, which on the left is, I think, a famous ACC slide. I think I stole it from Edgar. Green custodians, if you like, on the left, but for a lot of people, a menace or a problem. I know the municipal people in the room might see it that way. And actually a project that I'm involved in on the right, which is not far from here on the Cape Flats, which is pretty much the same people, not exactly, but same people, repurposing ferrochrome. You can see it in the bundles behind them. So circular economy, and added layer of this, selling their carbon credits, because we quantified that, to Coronation Fund in the city here. So I don't know if anyone's pension is with Coronation Fund, but thanks very much for footing the bill. I think it was money well spent, right? And this is actually very doable. I say I was involved involved as an observer. The people who you see in the picture on the right there are the people who drove this by themselves, on their own, without government support. And it's replicable, it's scalable, it's doable, and I think it repositions African countries and African industrial ambition in a much more positive light. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Anton. So Anton said he'd make one point, and he did. He made a clear, compelling point. A choice that we must make, and weaving together a connected strategy that links industry, the urban question, and climate. So I might push him a bit further during question time, because I know you have a lot of experience, including working on Tanzania's urban strategy. In terms of how might one catalyze this? How do you begin? Given the fact we in a continent with 54 countries, really complex interests, yes, we don't want to degenerate into squabbling over funding, and that's why the choice you offer, the pathway you offer, is a compelling one, but where and how to begin. But I want to ask you to answer that now, because we'll turn to Victoria. And Victoria Delbridge is the head of the International Growth Center, that's the IGC. The IGC's Cities That Work program. I know Victoria has got a Western Cape route, so she's got Western Cape roots, so she knows our context, but she's working internationally now. And the IGC is really an unusual university-affiliated research center, and I'm sure Victoria will say something about it. But from my quick reading, coordinating something like 1,000 researchers working in 15 to 20 low-income countries to try and drive change towards economic transformation. It's not what the run-of-the-mill university research center does. But Victoria is going to draw on the empirical work of the IGC to ask the question whether cities can indeed play the catalytic role that we have long been arguing that cities can and should. So I'm really intrigued to hear her perspectives on that. Victoria?
Great. Thanks so much, Philip, and great to be here with you all today. Just briefly, as Philip was saying, the International Growth Centre really tries to sort of play a role in bridging the gap between a lot of the academic research going on and then policy making on the ground. So making sure that the research that we're commissioning is extremely sort of relevant to practical policy issues. I won't take credit for the whole of the IGC. Our team, as Cities That Work, just does a lot of the synthesis of that research, bringing together sort of cross-country lessons. But to answer the sort of big question on the economic role of African cities in achieving Agenda 2063, I think the short answer is absolutely. They are essential and at the heart of achieving the agenda. I think the first reason is that no country in history has ever developed without urbanization and structural transformation from a focus on primary sectors such as agriculture and mining to value-added sectors such as industry and services. In Africa, already the majority of economic activity is occurring in African cities, particularly the primary cities. And for example, some cities like Kampala are already responsible for, there's a bit of discussion around it, but between 60 and 80% of the country's GDP. So that's a very sort of concentrated area where a lot of the economic activity in the country is happening. And makes it a very sort of politically sensitive area as well. Cities also are well known for offering higher incomes than rural areas. So in Kenya, these estimates suggest on average sort of 26% more. In Rwanda, recent studies have shown 17% higher wages in some of the secondary cities, but up to 71% more in Kigali, so in the sort of capital city. There's also recent evidence to show that, maybe unsurprisingly, urban jobs are a lot more resilient to climate change, less dependent on extreme climate events. And just simply the fact that people are already moving to cities, we're seeing that in all the sort of demographic transitions, and people are essentially voting with their feet. But then to go into, I guess, some of the challenges. So I think as we all know well, urbanization isn't delivering the same rewards in Africa as it has done elsewhere across the world. There are sort of new and old challenges, I think, that Africa is contending with specifically. So one is, as has been mentioned, sort of the urbanization in Africa hasn't gone hand in hand with industrialization as it has in other areas, and GDP per capita values are much lower. So we're trying to facilitate this transition to urban centers at much, much lower incomes than other parts of the world have done in eras before. There's still a much higher share of primary sector employment in cities, and as we know well, a lot of people working informally. This has led to sort of the term of consumption cities, which I think is, a way of looking at it, and also a way of showing that cities have become also very expensive places to live. A lot of the research is showing that cities in Africa are actually, if you look on sort of comparative terms, a lot more expensive than cities in other parts of the world relative to income. The climate crisis is, of course, not making this any easier. So we've talked about the sort of costs of climate vulnerability, issues around damages and loss, the future investments that are going to be required in adaptation that might be a lot higher than other cities around the world, global stipulations on what type of energy you can use to fuel growth. So I think none of us would want to steer away from a focus on renewables, but in some ways, and at least that's declining now, it can come at higher costs. Same thing with sort of meeting global ESG standards and various other things that might make things more expensive in the short term to achieve. And this can be quite a complex thing to navigate for policymakers in particular who are facing very urgent demands on the poverty and inequality side from their populations. I also, just to flag, I guess the other thing that's been mentioned quite a bit is the sort of phenomenon of urban to rural migration, which I think has happened consistently across countries around the world, but particularly inflated with sort of the challenges of climate change, which creates a lot of political and economic difficulties in the city. And just a shout out, because I know the mayor of Kilimane here is working a lot on really understanding how to integrate these migrants into the urban economy, how to sort of really ensure that they're absorbed into the urban fabric. So those are some of the challenges, but I think it's also really useful to talk about the new opportunities that the green or the net zero transition brings to. And maybe just going beyond green industrialization, I think that's definitely one aspect of it, but also the sort of other modern employment opportunities that can help to achieve growth. So one of these areas that we're seeing growing across the world now is in tradable services, aided by the sort of use of digital technologies, which is also, easier to make climate friendly than industrialization. But I think fundamentally just agreeing with what Anton said about sort of really needing to focus on the poverty alleviation and inequality reduction part at the center of any sort of green initiatives. So yeah, along with this, I think there's the fact that sort of new global value chains are emerging. There's a lot of innovation happening in various parts of the world, leading to new industries. And I think there's a really strong role for Africa to play in both contributing to this, but also leading on the innovation in some areas. I think it's been highlighted a lot already today that we have great resources to do so. We've got lots of people ready and willing to work. We've got the natural resources. And also just thinking about the fact that innovation doesn't need to mean, something futuristic, Silicon Valley, anything like that, but just looking at using local materials or context-appropriate processes is an incredibly valuable source of innovation as well. I think on that note, also just wanting to make the point about the fact that we need to look beyond just our sort of primary capital cities, but also at the secondary cities and how this sort of forms part of a coherent value chain. And I think, maybe this is coming to a bit on the sort of Pan-African point, but the Continental Free Trade Agreement and other initiatives in line with that are really paving the way for cities across Africa to sort of collaborate and coordinate on new industries and fostering sort of regional integration in that way. So I wanted to quickly run through, I guess, on the infrastructure lens, what a city needs to attract modern green opportunities. And I think these are things we all know very well, but maybe just to highlight a couple of points as I go through. So the one is well, maybe two in conjunction from a very purely economics perspective, is the focus on energy and connectivity. So the sort of foundation of economic growth. So the first on sort of stable and clean energy, I think this is a really, abundant opportunity for the continent. Not to do it because, the UK or Germany says so, or there's some obligation to contribute to mitigation, but because it really aids competitiveness in green industry. And I think there's another point to be made around the high costs in transporting renewable energy, which wasn't the case with fossil fuels, meaning that heavy industry that is carbon intensive in the future will need it to be located much closer to sources of energy than they have been in the past, giving another opportunity for Africa to attract more of this industry to home. We've spoken about the sort of capacity that we have, so I'm not going to go too much into that, but I think also just to make the point about adjusting to shrinking opportunities. So the fact that 30% of Africa's exports currently rely on fossil fuels. That demand is going to rapidly decrease in the coming years, and what are we doing to really diversify away from that? There's a lot of discussion around looking to other minerals that we're abundant in that are demanded for renewable energy technologies, rare earths, and the sort. We've got a lot of endowments in these, but I think, they do bring other environmental issues as well, and we need to tackle those. Connectivity, I think we know well, is one of our biggest challenges. Transport within cities, between cities, regional connections, really at the center of how we can facilitate trade. And I think if we compare with other cities across the world, the ratio of roads per square kilometer is much lower in Africa than other places. There's also been studies to calculate the loss to GDP from congestion, ranging from about 4% in Kampala to 8% in Sao Paulo, 15% in Beijing.
Could you wrap up? That's
Yes,
great.
I can. Just to say then, also on the connectivity side, the sort of digital technology. So thinking about the transport, but also how there's sort of digital technology that facilitates tradable services. And these are, contributing to vastly growing industries as well. Make a final point, and then I will leave some of the other bits for the discussion. I think one point to be made is also about the sort of contribution of livable, beautiful cities to economic growth. And I think the fact that sort of lots of African cities are yet to be built, and there's sort of this opportunity to make them green from the start. And I won't go into detail. I mean, there's aspects of how construction can add to sort of job creation, waste management can add to job creation and tradable sectors, water and sanitation adding to GDP, but just in general, thinking about livability of a city, not just as livability, but it's also a large determinant of FDI and people wanting to sort of invest and live in that city as well. So I'll end on that note with some more bits to come, hopefully, at a later stage. Thanks.
Wonderful, Victoria. So cities are central, even if they're not delivering all the rewards that have been promised on our continent, and even if the costs of the transition in the short term may be higher than elsewhere with political and economic difficulties, but Victoria didn't stop there, thankfully. And she presented a whole range of possibilities and opportunities, tradable services, innovation, the potentials of secondary cities, the values of enhancing connectivity, the opportunities that exist because a lot of the urban is still to be built in Africa and more. So very positive presentation, and thank you so much, Victoria. Okay, so let's move then from the African scale. Let's move down to our national scale. And we have with us Rudi Dix, who's the head of project management in the Presidency in the Office of the President. So there's a slight correction to the program. He tells me that he'd be taking someone else's job if he is designated as the head of investment and infrastructure. So Rudi is the head of project management in the Treasury. And I know him by reputation. I've met him today, but I know him by reputation. I can tell you it's a very good reputation. The way he's able to combine his real understanding of policy direction with his project management skills to drive change. I'm sure you can talk about Operation Vulindlela in the Presidency and so on. So Rudi has got this unique institutional position to talk to us about some of the challenges of driving change, including the change that's required for the just transition. Rudi?
Thanks, Philip. Thanks for that. Yeah, that is Jose Enzo Ramahopa's title. That's not my title, so
okay.
It's just important to correct that. I am in enough trouble as it is already by doing quite a bit of things and not being very popular in trying to drive through some of the reform programs. But I think the point is correct, and I'm just Anton and Victoria. He is quite critical. I thought Anton's point about developing a very integrated approach in trying to understand how one deals with development and sustainability, and that it's not two opposites. In actual fact, that developing an integrated approach is exactly what we're trying to do. And if I may just talk two areas, if that's okay. First, the area related to the just energy transition, and I thought perhaps just a bit of a comment around that, and how important that is in the context of where we sat, which is the second component, and that relates to the energy crisis that we sit with. And now, in a sense, these two kind of somewhat separate interventions intersect and support in, number one, providing energy security, and I think that's quite important, so meeting demand. Secondly, to ensure that we're able to get access, because access to energy is still an important area of work. Affordability, and fourthly, the issue around sustainability. So what is the kind of growth trajectory, since we are moving off a carbon-intensive economic growth trajectory that we've had for many, many years, for many decades, as we make decisions and reform decisions that clearly shows that we're moving into a different direction, right? And I thought that's perhaps an important area just to give a bit of context. So on the just energy transition, I mean, I think this is something that I missed earlier. Edgar was telling me I missed earlier on. I probably would be better if I wasn't here earlier on. But it's quite important to see this as in the context of not linked directly so to the COP negotiations. Because multilateral negotiations in itself is a complex thing. For many, Anton, who is involved in the IPCC, moves at a snail's pace. I think what has happened, and this has largely been the kind of trajectory that we've taken, albeit I think there's some conversations as to whether we slow in coordinating policy or whether we have consistent messaging. We don't have consistent messaging, that's quite clear, right? But that's besides the point. The point is that are we moving in the right direction? Are we taking the right policy decisions, and are we implementing those policy decisions in the right way, right? And I think this is quite important. So if one takes us back to the decisions that South Africa took and the cabinet took around, for example, a just transition framework, which was preceded by a national determined contribution. That's quite an ambitious NDC that was taken, right? We know that we're probably one of the few countries that decided that it's not going to be one particular figure, but it was going to be a range, right? Between, I think it's 350 and 420, if I'm not mistaken. And that decision 2 years ago set into motion quite a number of interventions, including the adoption of the Just Energy Transition Framework, an approach by international partner group countries or developed countries saying, well, South Africa, you've taken quite an ambitious stance around this. We're interested in looking at whether we're able to develop a partnership that could help around decarbonization. So the conversation was largely around how one decarbonizes the electricity sector. And of course, as we know, the electricity sector is important because it contributes 41 to 45% of total greenhouse gas emissions. So if you decarbonize the electricity sector, the impact that it has on any other production process would reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And that was quite important. And when we started getting into that engagements and negotiations, we introduced 2 additional areas, which I think was also quite important for us. And this was around autos, and we of course have a significantly large manufacturing auto sector over here. Globally competitive, well subsidized also. We have all the OEMs that have, major vehicles being manufactured and brands being manufactured over here. And we export about 200 billion rand per annum of autos. So it's one of our largest contributors in the manufacturing sector. We thought it's important that we needed to look at autos and electric vehicle components, since the EU is our greatest export partner for autos. And if they introduce a carbon border tax adjustment in 2034, we are in trouble. 2035, of course, seems quite a long way away, but in the greater schemes of how product development works for the OEMs, they work it out in 5 to 7 year cycles. So 5 to 7 year cycles of the old product comes to an end in the next 2 to 3 years. So you need to be on that if you want to get into the European market by 2035. So that's quite critical. We have a significant challenge if we're unable to deal with that. And the third component, of course, was green hydrogen. A lot of thinking through of it, not really gone into great commercial production. We have vast reserves that we're able to use in different forms of the green hydrogen. So this was quite important and critical in the way that we had this conversation. And of course, many of you have seen it. We've then introduced one of the first, an investment plan for 5 years to look at those 3 sectors. If you recall, our transition framework deals with 7 sectors. We've decided on that 3. So that's quite important, right? And electricity is top of that. So how does that relate to a number of interventions that are there? Because it's quite important, if we are going to decarbonize, that the impact that it has on the electricity sector, which is the greater focus of that 1.48 trillion rand that we set aside. If Trevor was a Minister of Finance, he'll be telling us you guys are not serious. How can you ask for a bill of 1.4 trillion rand? But the conversation in itself about that figure brings into acute the nature of the cost of a transition. That's the point. So when we talk about transition and our shift to net zero, or our shift by meeting ambitious NDC, it comes with a huge cost tag, right? Now think of us who has, our debt ratios are now at about 71, 72% of GDP, massive, the largest contribution of the budget is the cost of capital. Developing countries, or even low-income countries do not have the deep pockets or the financing available to be able to fund, and let's use it in South Africa's context of a 1.48 trillion. And that's not 1.48 trillion that takes us to net zero. This is 1.48 trillion that takes us within the next 5 years, right? And that's only for 3 sectors, so we've excluded the 4 other sectors. Our biggest contribution is towards energy and energy sustainability and the shift of decarbonizing, shutting down coal-powered fire stations, decommissioning, and of course, repurposing them. So this is quite an important and complex manner in the way that you want to deal with the just transition and the price tag that it comes to us. And that's why I think for us it's quite important to link it back. So while the issue around the Just Energy Transition Partnership and the investment plan is somewhat on the sides of COP, it begins to illustrate in the real sense the cost of transition in the conversations at COP around the multilateral negotiations on funding and financing, and why the ask of $100 billion a year funding is quite critical. Because if you take South Africa, it's taken 1 year of that 100 billion, because that's what it costs. It's $98 billion. But the transition in itself, I think, also gives us an opportunity. So it's in a sense a perfect storm, right? Because you sit with the energy crunch that we have. We can't meet, our supply can't meet our demand. At any given time, we're between 4,000 and 6,000 megawatts short per day. Our peak, somewhere between 27,000 when you more or less wake up in the morning, and up to 30,000 in the morning. During the day, it gets to about 27,000 megawatts, and it peaks again at about 8 o'clock, probably at about 8:30 at about 33,000 megawatts. We can only produce 27,000 of that, right? That's the reality of it. And of course, it does require for us, in the context of decommissioning and in the context of sustainable development, that we need, without a doubt, more megawatts onto the grid. The question is how one does that, right?
In 1 minute, Rudi.
I know, nada. Yeah. The question is how one is going to do that. And I think we've taken a clear policy choice that one of the mechanisms to do that is to open up the space for private sector generation and private sector investment, and for government to invest a lot more into the renewable energy frame. And I think that's quite important and quite consistent. Although government messaging is about a whole set of different technologies, which includes nuclear, which includes gas, depending on price, of course. Nuclear the same, depending on price. We are decommissioning in terms of the integrated resource plan, our coal-powered fire stations, because they've run the end of life. It's just you cannot be putting in more money into power stations that churn less and less megawatts of electricity and have a lower energy availability factor. So clearly, the choices that we've made in the way that we're seeing transition is that renewables has become part of that. And the evidence speaks for itself, because I think that, since this new administration had come in, we had unlocked the renewable energy independent power producer program. So already we're close to finalizing the last little bids on the bid window 5. We've put out a call for proposal and doubled it for bid window 6. We're hoping to put out the call proposal for bid window 7 as soon as possible. But that's not the biggest reform that has taken place in the energy space, by the way. The biggest reform was a slight tweak that we did, and I always say it as a tweak. We didn't touch the electricity amendment, the Electricity Act. We touched a schedule in that, a secondary piece of legislation, which related to SSEG, or embedded generation, which had the threshold, give me 30 seconds. 30. We had the threshold of how much private sector could produce and sell or produce for themselves. And that was 1 megawatt. That cap in itself, of course, was, had a limited opportunity for private sector investment. During the course of last year, we lifted that cap to 100 megawatts. And this year, we removed that cap. So with a small tweak in promoting private sector generation, we were able to get today close to 110 private sector projects, totaling 9.2 gigawatts of electricity. That's the pipeline of investment that is there in the energy generation space. Now, if that doesn't deal with, I think, Anton, the kind of industrialization and the huge amounts of investment that we need in PV, for example, or wind turbines, and I think then there's something really wrong in the way that we're going to have to organize ourselves if we cannot secure that kind of industrial opportunities that is there. Okay. So I just think that the space is changing quite dramatically. It's a perfect storm. There is this issue around a just energy transition. We have electricity crisis. I think all of them plays into the intersect, and I think it gives us an opportunity to address, I think, what Anton says, both industrialization and sustainability on the same coin.
Wonderful, Rudi. Thanks. Great. Spoken without any notes. So, from the heart. So I'll leave it. Trevor's chairing the next session, so he can deal with the 1.48 trillion price tag. But certainly looking from the outside, we do get frustrated with the mixed messaging. I won't mention ministers' names and so on. But it's really important, I think, to get a perspective which gives us some sense of the logic that is being carried through, perhaps behind closed doors, perhaps not that accessible to us. And I'm happy to go with the glass half full, that the transition gives opportunities. So thanks so much, Rudi. But now our final speaker is Jane Weru. And Jane is here in her capacity as Executive Director and founder of the Akiba Mashinani Trust. And of course, there's a lot more to say about the way she's been driving change through activating civil society. I think the Pamoja Trust and her role as a legal advocate and more that I need to know about. But we're moving now, I'm not saying going downwards because that sets up the hierarchy, going to the community level. And we know that policy making happens in these closed doors in the presidency or within the debates at COP. And it happens through pacts between elites, largely. So the question is, does it have to be so? Can the urban poor have a meaningful role within these policy processes, which are often so abstracted, although critical in terms of setting direction? And we're going to ask Jane to give us some insights from her significant experience. Jane, 8 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take from Edgar and share with you a story. And it's a story of how the city of Nairobi has tried to address the issue that really dogs it down, the issue of informality and the urban poor and their settlements. And this story begins in the year 2012. In this year, a group of people came to us from a settlement called Mukuru that's near our industrial area. And they came and they told us and asked us whether we could assist them to buy the land on which they were living. They told us that they had been told that if they do not buy the land, they would be evicted. And so they wanted us to give them a small loan because we have a small fund to buy the land. And we thought, yeah, probably we could do it. But before we could finish this transaction, we had another group and another group. And we realized that we had a big structural problem on our hands. So the first thing we did was to try and secure them against eviction. So we went to court and we managed to obtain injunction orders. But we also realized that we needed to understand the problem that they faced. And so we were lucky. We managed to get a grant from an organization called IDRC to conduct a study to understand the settlement better. So what did we find? We found that this community of about 100,000 households that occupied about 600 acres of land was living on private land. That this land had been granted to a group of people, mostly industrialists, by the Kenyan government to develop light industries. We also found that the grants they held had special conditions of grant. They had been told that they needed to develop plans for the development of their light industries within a period of 6 months, and that they were required to develop those industries within a period of 2 years. They had not developed the land and were merely holding it for speculative purposes. So the land was invaded by a group of informal developers who built row after row of tin houses with next to no services. So we have a situation where 94% of the people who live on that land are tenants. We also discovered the extreme marginalization that existed in this settlement. We realized from our research that this settlement had only 3,863 pit latrines, that these latrines were emptied manually, and the raw fecal waste put onto hand carts and emptied in our rivers. We also listened to the women who told us the effect of not having toilets in their homes and the shame and indignity of having to squat in front of your children at night because you cannot leave to pay for a toilet, for the use of a toilet. We also discovered that the county, or our city government, had only reticulated water to the edges of this settlement that had the city's poorest, and that water was then distributed by informal settlement in form of water providers at a cost of 400% higher than the rest of the city. So the poor were suffering a terrible poverty penalty. We discovered that this settlement had next to no roads, that it would have been impossible, even if the government was willing, to lay down the necessary water and sanitation infrastructure. So what did we do? We took our findings to the city government and we shared with them. And what really hit them most was that though this settlement was very poor, it was rich in resources, and that the people in this area were ready to pay for the services that they were using. And so the city government asked us, so what do we do? And we asked them, when we responded and we said, the laws of our land provide that you as a county or city government can declare an area with unique development opportunities and challenges as a special planning area. And that once you declare that area as a special planning area, then you can develop special plans that are responsive to the unique development challenges of that particular area. And so the city in the year 2017 declared Mukuru as a special planning area. And that's where the big challenge began. This is a huge area, complex, and with many contested interests. And so the city asked us, so how do we do this? And we said, why don't we mobilize the people who are already working there, civil society organizations, academia, to assist you to plan? And the city said yes. And we managed to mobilize 42 organizations that agreed to provide their services pro bono to the city of Nairobi to plan this settlement. Those are our African heroes. So they started planning, they collected information, and today we have an integrated plan for this particular area. Once COVID came, the government realized that if it did not do something, then Nairobi could be, I don't know what to say. I think we saw those pictures of Africa, the perception of what Africa would be during COVID. And I think our government was scared. And so they took the plans that were developed And they opened up roads, they laid infrastructure, they built hospitals, they built schools. And today this settlement is changing because of the work that was carried out by the city, its partners, and the people of Mukuru. But though progress has been made, there's still many big challenges. And probably one of the biggest is the land issue. The Mukuru land today, the 600 acres or so, is worth about $500,000 for an acre. And I think one of the biggest challenges is whether the state and the private sector will give up this land for the development of Mukuru. That is still a big challenge. And thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Jane. It's really an important reminder that unless we engage this perspective, we'll be confused as to why policies don't land, or why policies with good intentions actually may have really negative consequences for people on the ground, and often through the agency of what happens to land. So, but the other point that was made in the presentation is we can plan in a different way. There are other ways of doing things, and it's important to remember that because we get very embedded in our ruts. So thanks so much, Jane. We do have some time, and maybe we can take 5 minutes since we started about 10 minutes late, so we'll just take 5 extra minutes. So let me, I'm sure the roving mics are there. Let me open it up. I'm in the spotlight, so I can't see exactly who's got their hands up, but I see a hand there. Another hand? There's another one, yes, in the middle at the top there.
Oh, there, sorry.
Thank you very much, Chair and the panel. My name is Mtobeli Kolisa. I'm from the South African Local Government Association. In the course of last week, I had an opportunity to spend a lot of time with a mayor of a small municipality in South Africa, Tswelopele municipality in the Free State. It was a municipality that at the time was facing a serious crisis of floods. What she was saying to me is that she is listening to the debates at COP between developing countries and developed countries around contributions and responsibilities, and wondering to what extent do national governments recognize that the same dynamic of contributions and responsibilities applies at a national scale between cities and smaller municipalities. That which we argue as developing countries in our engagement with developed countries actually is the same at a national scale between the cities and the smaller municipalities. And she was saying that she's concerned that this might be lost as we make commitments as nations, nationally determined contributions. Those nationally determined contributions, in fact, will borrow from the carbon credits of smaller rural municipalities in order for nations to meet their own commitments. Now, she was saying that probably the problem lies with the fact that policy development tends to be driven by urban elites at a national scale, without much of a contribution by rural and peri-urban poor. And further, that as we know, at least in the South African context, that dichotomy urban, rural, developed and underdeveloped is also taking a racial a pattern as well. Now, I just want and this background comes to a question, maybe Rudi, you may want to deal with it, in the context of our just transition in South Africa. To what extent does our just transition become just in relation to smaller and bigger municipalities. Is there that consciousness that the justness needs to also address that particular dynamic?
Thanks very much. And maybe other panelists could also talk to that. Other comments or questions? Yeah, over here. You're asking a question, and there's a third question here.
Okay, thanks. My name is Damani Hlalele from Arab. I just wanted to make some observations and maybe a question to the panelist. In particular, in South Africa for the last 30 years, I think the minister here was one of those people that were driving the whole issue around industrialization in South Africa. Through special economic zones to stimulate economic growth, but also to create jobs. I think over the years, the stuff what has always been fascinated to me was where there's a clear separation between industrialization and how we create innovation ecosystems. And because if I look at countries like China, they managed to drive some of their industrialization by actually innovating and creating that innovation to drive change. So maybe from the panelists, why is that the case? Because some of my observations is we need to start with our education system and how we actually drive skills development, and then how we drive entrepreneurship to make sure that all of that partnership between our education, our innovation, our private sector, and government, we work in a partnership to drive industrialization. So I just wanted to reflect, because some of those mistakes will probably, if we don't learn from them, the just transition could be another thing where it's actually driving innovation, and then some of the people who are supposed to benefit or be looked after due to the loss of jobs or to be repurposed to other jobs, whether we'll be learning from that.
Okay, thanks so much. I'm glad there's a question about industrialization. It was one of the themes of the panel. Third question here.
Thank you. My name is Michael Keith. And I guess it's a question that goes back to Anton's first contribution, but to all of the panel, which is about speed. Because from this morning, there was a discussion about thinking through transition at geographically different scales. But we don't always recognize, I guess, that not only have we got plural scales of geography, but also time doesn't move at the same speed for different processes we're talking about. So if we're bringing industrialization, green transition, and climate change into the same conversation, these things move at very different speeds. The speed of value capture on infrastructure is not the same as the speed of climate change, which is not the speed of social transition. And building on the China point, I'm afraid I know little about Africa, but I've worked in China a number of years, and I come here from Bangladesh. And just to take two examples, Bangladesh is held up as a big success story, partly on the basis of weak institutions and that have been matched by strong civil society organizations like BRAC and Grameen that have worked at decades producing changes in labor market participation, gender empowerment, changes in demography and comparative advantage, particularly in the rag trade, I guess. But that's a model that takes decades. And at the same time, if you look at China, we have in the IPCC reports notions of sometimes what they call social discount rates as to whether you can measure what you get from $1 of investment today in terms of dollars of return down the line. But within the IPCC reports themselves, social discount rates, without going into too much detail, are sometimes discredited because of Bayesian statistics and what they call fat-tailed risks. But it basically means that it is very difficult to quantify the calculability of risk in terms of the unknown unknowns, if you like. And if you look at the China model, you have got an attempt to leverage land producing one transition being translated into what may or may not work, a massive state-based move into a green economy. Now that implies a different institutional configuration that relates back to what Mark Swilling was talking about this morning, I guess. But the simple question, I guess, for the panel is, how do you think about different speeds simultaneously in order to maintain this conversation of these three dynamics of green transition?
Thanks. Not a simple question, but but it's an important question. So let me just hold fire for the moment and return to the panel. So there's an important question around the rural-urban, because we know how interconnected the rural and the urban is, and we've been talking through the frame of the urban. There's a specific question around catalyzing industrialization, and there's this complex but important question about speed in weaving together discussions and policies in different domains. So where should we start? Anton, you might want a few minutes to think about that. Rudi will start. Okay.
I can jump in.
Jump in, Rudi.
Okay, wonderful. So, Ntoko, sorry, I didn't get the full name. I just got the first part of the name. So please don't be offended if I'm calling you Ntoko. I mean, I think it's part of the conversation that is, you used an example of of this particular woman who has been affected by floods, right? And again, the way we look at climate change is, even in the same geographical space, we have to look at it very differently, right? So I know, for example, if one talks about the floods in KZN, you're required to think very differently. I mean, think about Mboweni, which was ravaged by the floods, right? I understand that, for example, the last time there's been investment and infrastructure development for it to become climate resilient has never happened before. You know, the kind of infrastructure that is there was maintained infrastructure from the 60s and the 70s. So you need to put a large amount of money for it to become more climate resilient. And that goes to the heart of some of the debates around who has to pay for that, you know, and the cost of that. But you can't wait for those debates to be resolved at the multilateral forum. So you have to pay for it, right, at the end of the day. But the broader comment that you make around just transition is quite critical. Because I think if one looks at it in the context of, and I relate it to my experience on the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan and its focus on the coal belt, right? Because you will see in the integrated resource plans, there is a specific target of decommissioning of a number of power stations, right? And we're looking by 2035 for about 25 gigawatts of electricity that will be decommissioned, right? What happens to the power station workers that are there in those areas? Kriel, Tutuka, you know, all of these power stations that surround Malatleni or somewhere close to Free State, right? What happens to those power station workers? And all of us know the design of our power stations is where our power stations are built by a coal mine, right? And so there's a kilometer-wide, conveyor belt that transports the coal. So you have coal miners that are there. And then you have the interconnection of supply chains, right? Formal supply chains, informal supply chains, everybody working off that particular value chain that's there. And I think it's pertinent for us because I used to work for COSATU for many years, for 24 years. This is not the first transition. There are many other transitions that we have experienced. We experienced transitions in South Africa in 1994. We experienced numerous economic transitions post-1994. Transitions don't work well for workers and poor people, man. Right? I mean, that's the reality. And we have to invest time, money, and effort into ensuring that that reality is something that we don't. It's the reason why do you think workers would say to us, we don't trust you. You've promised us this before. Or communities will say, well, we don't actually trust you also because you've also said. So it's an important opportunity for us while we still can. Time is against us, right? I mean, I think Mike's point about speed and time. Time is against us in this instance, right? We've set ourselves this target of decommissioning and, of course, of repurposing these power stations. We need to think about the complexity of how we deal with skilling. How do we deal with those who initially would have been trained at a university or a technikon or some form of post-school education to work within the coal value chain, to work where else? How do we think about industrial development, for example? So what happens in these provinces? It would have been probably easier for us if one had to develop a set of interventions if coal-powered fire stations had been across all 9 provinces. You could dissipate it. There's different economic activity. But you have boom 14 power stations all in one province, all needing to be decommissioned over the next few years. The cost to that economy, to that province, that geographical space is huge. And therefore, concerted and well-designed effort is required. And I think the starting point, I don't want to, the starting point is that investment plan. Because it does begin to put numbers to that transition, to that justice component that is there. And I think this is quite important that we do not lose sight. I mean, I think for people in this forum, it's quite important because, again, what happens to the cities and the towns that have been developed around that? We're classic and known for having ghost towns, right? Once industrial development has left. But are there new forms of industrial development that we can think about? What are the kind of city planning that is there? For instance, if it is that renewables is an area of intervention, does it mean that we should move renewable production to that province? Would it be cost effective? These are the kind of questions that we need to ask. Are there other forms of value chains that they could participate in terms of that industrial development? Right now, for example, I gave you an example of private sector investment. That's 9 gigawatts of renewable energy. We have 2 firms, by the way, only 2 firms, private sector firms. IDC has a bit of money in both of them. Serafin and, sorry, I forgot the other firm's name, but they produce maximum of 600 megawatts of PV production per year. Our demand is close to 7,000 now. Right? So there's clearly an opportunity to look at industrial development. There's a conversation that we need to have about how we link our industrial development to the rest of the continent if our focus is to move towards renewable PV production or wind turbines. So I think, Phil, that for me is the nub of it. And I think it's quite pertinent that we do spend a lot more time and effort on the just component, right? And how we ensure that that does become a reality. We cannot be paying grants to workers and communities who are going to suffer as a result of decommissioning. We have to create real opportunities, both in terms of formal employment and economic earning opportunities outside of formal employment.
Great. Thanks so much. Quoting Rudi, transitions don't work well for poor people. So they do have to be carefully managed, and we're getting to the nub of the real discussion. But let me just work down the line here. Victoria, do you want to?
Yeah. I'll maybe come in also on the sort of question about small municipalities and feed into the others from there. But I think I really am glad you raised that point, because I think, both sort of more rural municipalities, but as they sort of grow into intermediate cities, play an incredibly important role in sort of industrial transition as well. And are also an incredible social safety net to people sort of moving out of the agricultural sector. And they're also growing the fastest in terms of population, usually. So I think what's interesting about that is we also have an opportunity to invest in those cities before they grow, before a lot of people settle there, and get that infrastructure in ahead of the time, and infrastructure that's better than the ones we've perhaps used in the past. And I think particularly to emphasize there, why, so in a lot of countries, and I think including in South Africa, there's become the sort of focus on like futuristic smart cities and building new cities and charter cities and all sorts of things like that. When we already know that people are moving towards these sort of secondary, smaller municipalities, and with the limited resources we have, maybe we should really be doubling down on focusing, getting those places more sustainable, more livable, more productive, than trying to create new cities in entirety. I won't go into the dynamics on SEZs, but I think I feel similarly on that topic, where, in some ways they're a very useful tool for innovating new policies and tools, but they're also incredibly expensive and disjointed from the rest of the economy unless there's a really, really strong way to integrate it. I don't know if I'm going to try and attempt to answer the speed question, because I think it's a very difficult one, but it's a really, really, really important one. And I think one of the sort of last points I wanted to make, which maybe links to this, is I think we know a lot about the solutions that we need, the sort of practical infrastructure and services, but I think maybe thinking a bit more about the things that are holding us back. So things around the sort of these difference in speeds, how financing does not sort of keep up with, what we want to be investing in, with new technologies, with political pressures, with poverty reduction. So just thinking about what these sort of bigger forces are, and I think that brings in discussions on sort of regulation, land right, the costs of capital. Hopefully stuff we're going to focus on in the next session, but I think also a lot of vested interests that need to be tackled both at the sort of local level, but very much internationally as well. But yeah, I'll leave it there and pass it on.
Great, thanks. Jane, do you want to?
Yes. Just one small thing. I think when we look at urbanization and seeking for solutions in urban poor communities, I think it is critical that we question the existing rules and regulations. Do we need a 30-meter road reserve all the time? And I think one of the lessons that we learned from Mukuru, the Mukuru SPA, and the challenge that is implicit in the declaration is that we must begin to seek for unique solutions to the unique challenges that the urban poor faced. And so in Mukuru, the county government of Nairobi agreed that they could change the width of arterial roads from 30 meters to 12 meters, because they realized that if they stuck with a 30-meter road, then the whole of Mukuru would be a road, 100% displacement. So that challenge, I think, exists for all of us. And we must be very pragmatic and begin to look for solutions that address the unique challenges that face us in our informal settlements.
Thanks so much. And Anton, how do we begin weaving together these domains?
Okay.
And how do we address the simple question?
So I get the simple question.
Yes.
Great. And I'll try and stitch it together with China and risk as well. So speed, or Michael, temporal scale, I think is the phrase that my geography friends would use in the room. And I think that's the opportunity that's been referenced. We have 1,000 days on the climate issue. By that, what we mean is by 2030, I think we'll know one way or another, we'll know whether we are preparing for climate catastrophe or whether we have a chance, right? And 2030 is probably, it's not that far away, right? That's the 1,000-day issue. And the point that I was trying to make, in linking climate, industrialization, and urbanization, and trying to make that one conversation, is that in that same period, 250 million people will be added to urban spaces on the African continent. So we've got to do both together, right? We've got to bring those two speeds, reconcile them, and make it one thing. We've got to harness the mega trend of urbanization, which is not going to go away. It's baked in, and could be a good thing, and then make it work for the 1,000 days we have left on the climate crisis. Right? When I'm in an optimistic mood, that's the opportunity, right, as well. So we have to make it happen. But I'm glad China came up. You can't have a conversation about green industrialization without talking about China. And of course, it's the go-to reference for the industrial conversation when we have that conversation in African countries, in my experience. The point is that China took the last remaining gap on carbon, right? We don't have the scale to boss the global economy around that China does, so let's be very clear on that. But even if we did have that agency, China took the last remaining gap on carbon, and I think used it very well, and actually did the world, in some ways, a huge favor on the renewable energy front. But that gap is now closed, so it's not available for replication. It's not a pathway that we can look to emulate in any sensible way. SEZs or not, I think you probably sense what I feel about SEZs, but Heather, if you can combine green hydrogen with desalination and wind power at Atlantis, all strength to you. And let's make it happen, because we need that, right? But I suppose my fundamental point is, and with iron and steel, of course, because that's possible, right? So we could have a new industrial compact with green hydrogen, iron and steel, wind power, and desalination, and that would, I guess, probably be a good thing. But my fundamental point is, let's just get back to competitive advantage, which is the simple way of understanding that is just what can we do, what do we do relatively well, and that requires us to think about what we're already doing and what we need. And we need, for these 250 million people, we're going to need a lot of material, a lot of energy, a lot of food, a lot of mobility. And And let's link that back to the value chains that we have and then build them out. That's the sort of industrial strategy that I'm really comfortable with, not for any ideological reason, just because I think it has a slight chance of maybe working. And we haven't had great success in this in the past. And a final point, if I may, Phil, just on risk, because it was made before and it's come up, and not to get ahead of the finance conversation which is coming, but we've got to somehow get past the idea of the conflation of what is called risk by the financial sector, but is actually either uncertainty or their unfamiliarity with what's on the ground, right? And to somehow make ourselves legible and make the value that we do bring to the global table on climate, on nature, and on livelihoods and on migration, if you like, we can throw that in as well, to bring that into the risk conversation and say, right, how much do you want this, and what are you prepared to pay for it? Because that's how we'll mobilize, whether it's funding or finance or whatever, but it requires a new conversation on risk.
Great. Thank you so much. We've had a rich discussion. There's no time to open up further discussion. But for me, there were at least two big themes. One, of course, is the theme that Anton introduced at the beginning, and that's connecting across the domains of discussion and policy and how we begin to do that. And the other one, of course, is connecting across the scales. So how do the agreements reached at COP or the agreements that are worked out in Rudi's office, how do they land locally? How do they land in communities? And to what extent can there be feedback into those processes, to use policy lingo? To what extent can an understanding of what is really happening at community level around land, for example, in people's real lives, inform these bigger discussions? So it's something to think about. You know, it's about connecting the discussions. There's a lot more to say, but I think we're out of time. So Edgar, it's yours.
Thanks so much to Phil and to the panel. So the good news is I'm not infringing on your break. Everyone has got ample credit because unfortunately, one of our speakers for the next panel, Catherine Kaufman, who is the head of project preparation at the Development Bank of Southern Africa, has got to carry some projects into the Exco today, this afternoon. So she couldn't fly down this morning, and since her life revolves around billions, you know, we kind of take that excuse. So that buys us a little bit of time. So we will start at 4:15 sharp. So please be up here by 12 minutes past, 13 past. Do all your chit-chatting in the passageways, and then we can start by 4:15. And then we will go into the evening drinks and entertainment. Thank you very much to the panelists.